All right, good afternoon. To understand the Latter-day Saints and the 250th anniversary of the United States, we have to start with a little history. But of course, the historian is going to say that. In 1776, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was not yet founded. However, from the earliest days in the history of the church, in the 1830s, its leaders and members have revered the founding of the country. And this comes in an interesting moment. In the wake of the violent expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from Jackson County, Missouri in 1833, church leaders are discussing how they can seek redress for their violated rights and for their confiscated properties. And it's in this setting that Joseph Smith, the church's prophet and president, dictates a revelation that is written in the voice of God. And this revelation is later canonized in Latter-day Saint scripture. And a verse of it reads as such: "And for this purpose have I," meaning God, "established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood." So the very first Latter-day Saints saw the founding of the United States as a divinely orchestrated event significant to God's plan for the redemption of humankind. And this wasn't in and of itself a unique position at this time. This was a time of providential rhetoric, providential explanations, not just in the United States, but in Great Britain and in a host of other Western countries. People like to know that their country is favored by God and that their country has a special role to play. Americans and the Latter-day Saints, not unique in this sense at all. However, their rhetoric had less to do with the United States and much more to do with what the United States was a means to. The country was not the great ends. The founding of the country was a means to a greater end. And so they celebrated the founding of the United States even as they looked forward to the second coming of Jesus Christ and a millennial era where there would be no nations, where there would be no national distinctions. And this matters because the Latter-day Saints saw themselves as being cast in a starring role in the last chapter of God's plan for the redemption of humankind. As Christians, the Latter-day Saints are neither Protestant nor Catholic. More commonly, they are categorized as Restorationist Christians, believing that the gospel of Jesus Christ was restored in its fullness through a series of visions and revelations to prophets such as Joseph Smith. So as the early Latter-day Saints saw it, the founding of the United States allowed for greater religious freedom. And that greater religious freedom paved the way for the restoration of the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So to early Latter-day Saints, the founding of the United States, again, mattered, but it was not the end in and of itself. It was the means to a grander end. And so what did they mean exactly by a divinely inspired and orchestrated founding? Well, early Latter-day Saints, even as they celebrated the country, lamented that too often it was not living up to its grand ideals. This verse of Latter-day Saint scripture comes even as they were violently expelled from their property in a country that celebrated liberty and justice for all. Clearly, it did not mean all. And so the Latter-day Saints could celebrate the founding and be critical of their country when it fell short at the same time. These two things were not mutually exclusive. And they could also look at the founding as divinely inspired, but also see shortcomings in the founding documents and in the founders. Those two things did not negate each other. I'll give you an example, one of many. Joseph Smith in 1844 ran for president of the United States. Spoiler alert, he didn't win. But in his pamphlet supporting his campaign, he opens the pamphlet celebrating the greatness promised by the United States and lamenting that, quote, some 2 to 3 million people are held in bondage because the skin that covers their soul is a different color than ours. In this pamphlet that he celebrates America and the founding, he also is just very honest and forthcoming about its shortcomings. Divinely inspired to Joseph Smith did not mean perfect. Divinely inspired founding documents did not mean infallible. He could celebrate and lament all at the same time. Now, this is important history, not just because I'm a history nerd who loves this stuff, but we've seen various trajectories of how the founding is talked about over the course of Latter-day Saint history. It is consistently revered and celebrated by American Latter-day Saints. But what the meaning of divinely orchestrated and inspired is, that has been contested even in subtle ways. And once you get into the 20th century, especially post-World War II, you get a more prominent interpretation that is much less nuanced than Joseph Smith's and much more celebratory, and divinely inspired sometimes means that the Declaration of Independence and Constitution should be read in the same way that Scripture is read. And I'm not saying that all Latter-day Saints subscribe to this interpretation, but it becomes far more common in the 20th century, even as Joseph Smith had given a different example. And so what of the Latter-day Saints today and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States? Well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a global faith. It has American origins in its founding, but it now has far more members living outside the United States than in the United States. Still, the story of American independence is part of the church's story, part of the story of restoration. And so in the United States, Latter-day Saints, have already started, and we can expect more, to celebrate the founding of their country, and to do it in many of the same ways that their non-Latter-day Saint neighbors do, but also with this lens toward what the Revolution and American independence set in motion. Institutionally, I think there are a number of ways that we'll see the church and its members recognize the 250th anniversary. One is going to be through acts of service. Now, this is a long-standing tradition in Latter-day Saint culture, but even more recently, I think starting in 2021, on September 11th of every year, church congregations join in a concerted day of service as we remember those who lost their lives on the attacks of September 11th, 2001. The way that they commemorate that day is to serve their communities. And the church itself has announced that as part of America 250, they are donating 250 semi-truck trailers full of food that will be delivered to food banks in 50 states. There will be in church magazines articles on the religious freedom and the founding of the United States. I know this because I wrote one of them on the Declaration of Independence, and they haven't pulled it yet, so as far as I know, it's going to be there. But there will also be other ways that the church commemorates this. On May 31st, they've asked congregations in the United States to meet in the hour time that's normally spent for Sunday school or meetings such as that, having discussions as congregations about America's founding and religious freedom in particular, and how we can treasure and build greater universal religious freedom. On July 5th, the First Presidency, the governing body of the church, has asked church members to join in a day of fasting and prayer to give thanks for the religious freedom brought forth eventually by the revolution, and to pray that it will be strengthened and made better and more universal. And I anticipate we'll have a host of other speeches and statements all centered around this celebration. But again, with the theme being the United States was not the end, it was a means, or is a means, to a greater end that is much more universal, as it's put in Latter-day Saint history and Scripture. But in closing, I think it's also important to note that Latter-day Saints themselves are not immune to the polarization of our time. Even as we see the 250th anniversary of the United States be a time of celebration, but also a time of contestation. Which parts of the founding do we celebrate? Which ones do we downplay? Can we talk about it in all the good and all the bad that came from it? And in this sense, the Latter-day Saints are not exceptional. American Latter-day Saints are, after all, Americans, and they are battling with this the same way that everyone else is. And so it will be interesting to see how this perspective of the revolution and the founding, bringing about greater religious freedom, which Latter-day Saints believe brought about the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ, with the end of the salvation of humankind in mind, how that factors into the celebrations, but also the contestations over the 250th anniversary. If I could tell you exactly how that would play out, I wouldn't be a historian. I'd be in a profession that profits off of prognostication. But it is something that as a scholar and as a Latter-day Saint, I will be watching with great interest. Because to Latter-day Saints in the United States, America's 250th anniversary is not merely a historic commemoration or a patriotic celebration. In many ways, it can also be seen as a spiritual moment. Thank you.